Heartbroken parents see mysterious woman at son's grave. What she tells them is shocking. Mary and Peter were grieving the loss of their son, who tragically passed away. They made it a point to visit his grave each day. However, they started to notice that someone always beat them to it. A fresh rose appeared on their son's grave every day. It left them wondering who was behind this thoughtful act. Determined to solve the mystery, Peter decided to set up a camera. What he discovered left him utterly stunned. As they gathered the footage from the camera, Peter and Mary felt a curious blend of excitement and uncertainty coursing through them. Little did they know, they were about to witness something that would completely catch them off guard. And unable to handle their onslaught of emotions, Peter and Mary found themselves unable to watch the footage until the following day. They needed to confirm that they were making the right choice, as adrenaline was still surging through them. They needed to calm down a bit before making such a big decision. Peter and Mary anxiously watched as the screen flickered and a pop-up appeared. With anticipation building up, all they needed to do was press play to uncover the mystery of who had been leaving those red roses on their son's grave. And who was behind this heartfelt gesture? And would Peter and Mary decide to confront the person responsible? Mary and Peter had never fully moved on from the pain of losing their son, Michael. Michael, who was only 18 years old, tragically lost his life in a car accident, leaving his parents devastated. Since that tragedy, it had been challenging for the couple to navigate life as just the two of them. As parents, they never anticipated the heartbreaking reality of outliving their own child. After their son's untimely passing, they found themselves with very little money. Every penny they had saved was spent on his funeral arrangements. However, they never complained about their situation. They believed that their son deserved a peaceful final resting place and made a promise to continue looking after him, even in his absence. Little did they know the profound impact that Michael's death would have on their lives. They visited his grave every day, bringing flowers and mementos to remember him by. This became a routine for them, and a way of keeping him close. It was just the two of them, and they loved that one-on-one time, telling their son what had happened that day. But one day they noticed something strange. It was a Monday and Mary and Peter were on their way to the cemetery. But as they approached their son's grave, they noticed something lying on top of it. "This wasn't here yesterday," Mary said, and Peter agreed. Why would anyone put something on someone else's headstone? Mary and Peter were baffled. A single red rose was lying on the headstone, and they had no idea who had put it there. They looked around, but no one was in sight. They looked at the graves surrounding their son's grave to see if any more had red roses, but Michael was the only one. Strange, they thought. At first, they brushed it off as a random act of kindness by a stranger, but every time the rose wilted, a new fresh one appeared. They became increasingly curious about who would put these roses on Michael's grave, but there was no way of finding out who was doing this. Or so they thought. This went on for a few months, and they learned to appreciate the rose. But they were still keen on solving the mystery. But how? Then one day, Peter came home with an idea. What if we hang cameras on the premises? Pointed at Michael's grave, he asked his wife. But Mary wasn't impressed. "I'm sure that's against the privacy policy, Peter," she responded. But Peter didn't give up that easily. He was determined to find out who kept putting these roses on his son's grave. So one night, he buys a new security camera and drives to the cemetery without telling his wife. It was pitch black outside, and the only light he had was from his tiny pocket flashlight. He searched for the best hiding spot for the camera and looked to see if it had a clear shot at his son's grave, and it did. So he installed the camera and looked at it proudly. All he had to do now was wait. He went home and crawled into bed next to Mary, who pretended to be asleep. She knew what her husband had done that night, but she didn't stop him either. Deep down, she was just as curious as him to find out who this person was, but she wouldn't confess that to her husband. They continued to visit Michael's grave every day for the next 2 weeks. Peter kept acting suspiciously around the grave, sneakily looking at the camera. Mary noticed it, of course, but didn't say a word to Peter about it. She kind of liked having her own secret. But then, one day, Peter messed up. On a Tuesday morning, Peter and Mary got ready to head to the cemetery when they got a call. It was the cemetery's supervisor. Someone had complained about the camera, and the supervisor had to confiscate it. She noticed the footage was focused on Michael's grave, so she made the connection to Peter and Mary. Filming without everyone's consent was indeed against the cemetery's privacy policy, so she had to hand in the camera to the police. But because she knew Peter and Mary personally, she made an exception. She kept a copy of the footage, especially for them. But she didn't tell them what she had seen in the footage. She told Mary and Peter they could collect the footage at the end of the day today. This was great news for them because they couldn't wait any longer to find out who their son's mystery rose giver was. So they spent the day trying to distract themselves before it was time for them to head to the cemetery. After a few hours, they could finally come by the cemetery to pick up the footage. The cemetery supervisor waited for them at Michael's grave with the USB stick in her hand. But when she handed over the USB stick, she said something that Mary and Peter didn't understand. Not yet, at least. They briefly talked about how life was and how the parents were doing. But as the cemetery supervisor was leaving, she handed over the USB stick and said, "I thought you had to see this." Peter and Mary were a bit stumped by her remark, but everything would become clear to them in a few days. They took the USB stick home but suddenly felt hesitant to look at it. What did the lady at the cemetery mean when she said that to them? What if the way they remembered their son completely changed after they looked at the footage? They decided to sleep on it and see how they would feel in the morning. The next morning came and the USB stick was still on their kitchen table. They looked at it as they ate their breakfast. "What are we going to do?" Mary asked her husband. "Is it really worth it?" But Peter stayed silent, looking at the stick. Will this USB stick change their lives forever? Finally, Peter got up and grabbed the stick. I have to know, Mary. Otherwise, I can't move on," he said to his wife. And she agreed. Let's watch the footage together. As the team she saw Peter's demeanor change. He became more comfortable, but it wouldn't last very long. Mary got up and searched for her laptop. She put it on the kitchen table and turned it on. Peter and Mary gave one last look at each other as a way of saying, "We got this," but nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to see. Peter held the USB stick in one hand and Mary's hand in the other. He slowly reached for the laptop and put the USB stick in. They watched as the screen twitched and a pop-up opened. All they had to do now was press play to see who had been putting these red roses on their son's grave. Peter couldn't keep his hand from trembling when it was finally time to watch the footage. He had no idea what they were about to find out. Slowly, he moved his computer mouse over to the play button and made sure that Mary was ready for whatever they were about to see. The video started playing. When the footage rolled, there wasn't anything out of the ordinary. They could see that the camera had a clear look at the grave, but no one was in sight. After watching for over 5 minutes, Mary and Peter wondered if they'd made a mistake. But then they spotted something moving on the edge of the frame. There was a person wearing all black approaching their son's grave. They couldn't tell any details about who it might be. The only detail that stood out was the single red rose the visitor was carrying. They placed it upon the grave but didn't clearly show their face. Who was it? Mary and Peter replayed the scene over and over to see if there were any hints hidden in the footage. Mary swore that it was a woman, but the person was wearing enormous sunglasses that made it impossible to see the outline of their face. Yet there was something so familiar about the visitor. At last they realized why it seemed like they recognized the woman. It was because they actually knew her quite well. Mary questioned how it was possible for her to be there, but neither of them had any ideas. They knew that they needed to find out what she was doing at the cemetery. It had been over 10 years since they'd last seen the woman. Mary and Peter kept replaying the video. Finally, Mary explained that she wouldn't be able to rest without getting an answer from the woman herself. There was obviously something unusual going on. There was only one problem with that plan. Since so many years had gone by, Peter and Mary had no way of getting in touch with the woman. They had no friends who could have helped, so their only chance of speaking with her was to go to the cemetery and wait for her to return. It was a long shot, but the outcome was the last thing they ever expected. In the morning, Peter and Mary set out bright and early to head to the cemetery. They didn't know if the woman kept a routine schedule or if she only appeared when she had time. The last thing they wanted was to miss her because they showed up too late. When they arrived, someone was already waiting for them. When Peter and Mary got to the cemetery, they saw that the supervisor was already by their son's grave. She asked if they'd had a chance to watch the video. She seemed curious about what Mary and Peter might have discovered about the situation. But the couple also had questions of their own. Mary and Peter asked the supervisor if she knew anything about the woman, but the supervisor didn't know anything about her except that she came by on a fairly regular basis. The supervisor figured that the couple didn't know either since they'd set up the camera. But their response surprised her. When Peter explained that they knew who the woman was and simply wanted to talk to her to see why she was coming around Michael's grave, the supervisor realized the situation was even more complicated than she'd believed. It was obvious that Peter wasn't pleased with the woman's presence, but why? The supervisor wondered why the couple didn't just call the woman if they wanted to talk to her, but she didn't want to get too involved in their family business by asking. It was obviously a private matter. But instead of leaving them in peace, the supervisor did the total opposite. The supervisor pretended to go back to her office but turned at the last minute to hide behind a nearby tree. She was already involved to some extent and wanted to know what was happening with the mysterious visitor who came to the grave. And she didn't have long to wait. As she was hiding behind the tree, the supervisor noticed a car pull into the lot. It was one that she saw often, and she was positive that it belonged to the woman who came to visit Michael. She was so excited to finally hear the truth about what was going on. Peter and Mary didn't know that anyone was spying on them, so they simply settled in to wait. They saw the car pull into the lot, but they didn't get too interested until the door opened and a woman stepped out. They recognized her right away, even at a distance. It was her. Just like they'd seen in the video footage, the woman was carrying a single red rose. She approached the grave slowly and kept her head down. She seemed to know the way without having to keep too close of a look at the path. But when she finally glanced up, she froze. For a few moments, the three of them stood silently and stared at each other. None of them moved or spoke. The supervisor wasn't sure what was about to happen next. Would they fight? Argue? Scream? She started to wonder if they might even be a danger to each other. Finally, Mary took a step forward. The supervisor was surprised to see that she was smiling and even seemed to be crying from happiness. She called out to the woman by name, addressing her as Noah. The supervisor couldn't stop watching to see how Peter and the woman would react. Peter stepped forward as well and held out his arms to the woman named Noah. She didn't move immediately, almost like she was thinking about what she wanted to do next. But when she decided, she approached Peter and returned the hug. Suddenly, it was like all the tension had vanished. The supervisor felt guilty for spying on such a heartfelt moment, so she moved away from the tree and went to talk to the trio. They were all crying happily and embracing each other. It wasn't what the supervisor had expected to happen, but it was clear that she was missing some key details. The supervisor couldn't help herself from talking to them to hear the truth about the mysterious visitor to Michael's grave. Mary and Peter were a little confused about why the supervisor was still there and why she cared enough to keep tabs on what their family was doing. They found her next question even more unusual. The supervisor asked who Noah was to them and why there had been the need for such secrecy. Mary and Peter thought it was a bit rude of her to ask, but Noah didn't seem to mind. After all, the supervisor had gotten used to seeing Noah around. The answer was nothing short of shocking. Noah revealed that she was Mary and Peter's daughter. The supervisor couldn't believe it. She'd assumed that Noah wasn't related or perhaps was even an old friend or lover. But once she heard the truth, the supervisor was even more confused about why Mary and Peter had needed to spy on the grave. Noah explained that she ran away as a teenager and started a life of her own. When she finally wanted to reconnect with her parents, it had been so long that she wasn't sure they'd want to see her. So instead, she just visited Michael's grave on her own. But now that they were together again, Noah had a confession to make. Noah told her parents that she missed them and wanted to be there for them after hearing about Michael's death. But when they didn't recognize her right away at the funeral, Noah thought that maybe it had been too long since to reconnect. She still wasn't sure that Mary and Peter wanted to truly welcome her back into the family. Peter and Mary were more than thrilled to have Noah back in their lives. They'd missed her terribly and wanted to make up for the lost time in any way they could. They swore that they would never again let anything come between them, and together they would honor Michael's memory for years to come.